recording going, and that should be. There we go. Okay. So let's see, we're back in business here. Excellent. Okay. So some of the basics about data validation, and obviously that's one of the tasks that I gave you in the this last assignment is to see if you could add some of this validation to it. So I just wanted to put it all in perspective. So as I said, I'm not going to read everything here. You have it. Just to highlight the important bits is that virtually, well, not virtually, every web application that's going to interact with a user is, except if it's simply static link pushing, which is not very many if you think about it, is going to take data from a user some way, shape, or form, even if it's only survey information. So it's important that the forms, and those are HTML forms ultimately that you're interacting with, that they are validated in some way, so that the data that you're getting is in fact what you think you're getting. For some things, depends upon what you're doing. For different kinds of form widgets like checkboxes or list boxes, radio buttons, that sort of thing. There's not a lot of validation in that sense of the word that has to go on because they're sort of self-contained. But anytime you're collecting information like numbers, text, etc., it's always going to be an issue to somehow do it and do it properly so that you're getting the information that you want and it's coming to you cleanly to your application. So what you want is some mechanism to be able to do that in a reasonable way. So typically you want to be able to provide that to them. You want to be able to validate that it's proper, that it's there, first of all, that it's in proper format, that's the conversion issue, and that you have some way of closing the feedback loop so that in fact if they do something that you didn't want, then you can let them know so that they can in fact fix it. Okay, so that's the basic loop that we're talking about there. There was previous to, if we're just talking about the Java EE world, Java EE world, there was, as far as that was concerned, it was kind of, you still had to do it yourself. There was nothing built in to the servlet JSP world per se that helped with that very much. A little bit with this, the EL, the expression language, of which is the earlier version of what you're used to now, the language that uses the hashtags and the curly braces. So the developers in general were forced to use some other kinds of techniques, many times that they wrote themselves. So this was one of the motivations behind JSF being developed the way it has, is to make that a kind of a non-issue, have a lot of that stuff built in so that you as developers could focus more on the just the look and feel of the UI and the real harder part, often the business logic and getting that done right. So to give you the tools built in. So nowadays there are a number of techniques or tools that are given to you that make this easier. Okay, and again, we're talking in the Java world, but this is number one, for example, is true no matter which language you're using, as long as it's dealing with HTML. The newer versions of HTML, that is HTML5, now have embedded as part of the language, there is syntax for doing some basic validation itself, and I'll show you a little bit about that. Secondly, and this is what a lot of people were doing before some of these other tools came around, is people were either writing their own JavaScript routines to do form validation by capturing what the user was trying to do before it was sent to the server. So that you could, the JavaScript has a capability of reading the entire document object model tree and looking for what the user has done. So if they hit submit, that can be intercepted, so right inside the browser code, the local browser code, and then you can do something with that. I'll show you a trivial example of that just to give the idea. Then people have built on top of that. So for example, the JavaScript libraries like jQuery or Prototype or those things, Scriptaculous, have, and jQuery is probably the best known example of this because it has a plug-in architecture that allows people to add things to the basic structure of how it works. And a lot of people have added validation, form validation routines, so that you have a whole choice of them if you want to import this library. So that's another possibility. And then in our world here, we have a number of things. JSF tags, there are Java Bean methods that you can write. There are special validation routines that you can write that are JSF-based. There's something called the Java Bean Validation API, which is simply an annotation that you can tack on to your managed beans so that the data will never get into the bean unless it passes those validations. I'll show you the most simple one, @not null, okay? That you can simply tack on to your managed bean field, and the form will never be allowed to have a null in that field, even if you do nothing else, simply by putting in those few characters. Yeah.
I just have a quick question. Going back to the JavaScript one, there was an example in the reading that you gave us. It said JavaScript could be used to check to see if the username was already taken on the server side. So now the JavaScript is done client side.
Not directly.
Okay.
You could do that if what they're talking about is using Ajax. Okay, because what I was referring to here specifically was totally client side. Okay, which is something you want to do. I mean, just in general, isn't it always better if you can get away with it to force the person's machine to do the processing, and then you never have to use the network and you never have to use any of your computer on the server side. So, but that's one of the issues that comes up is what you just mentioned. There's certain kinds of validation that are, if you think about it, are just impossible to do strictly on the client side because the information doesn't live there. Most of it would, like that, to know what user IDs are available or what, is this a valid, I'm sorry?
Valid email or not?
Well, valid in a more, valid not in the sense of, is it a number versus a string, but valid in the sense of a more logical validation. That's probably, the one you mentioned is probably the most easy one to point at. But you can imagine there are many other things like that require access to data someplace else that doesn't reside on the client. So that anytime you have that, then of course that forces you to think about how do you do that. What they were referring to, you'd have to point me at exactly which thing you're referring to, but I'm positive that must be Ajax. I haven't really gotten to what Ajax is all about, but just very briefly. The idea, Ajax stands for Asynchronous Java and XML, that's where the name came from. It's not a tool in itself. It's not literally a piece of code somewhere. It's really a concept of how you can use from JavaScript on the client, how you can communicate with the server directly without having to have it go through the entire HTML generation process. So it's kind of like it was actually in the JavaScript definition, and people didn't realize that it could, this thing, it's called XML HTTP request. It's a subroutine in the JavaScript libraries. And until this one person, I can't think of his name right now, realized how it could be used, there was no way except sending entire HTTP posts or GET requests to ask for things. Ajax is kind of a hole there that allows the JavaScript on the client to actually make requests directly, still using HTTP, mind you, make requests directly to the server just for example, pieces of information like that, okay? And that's in fact...
So the HTML on the client side doesn't really have to get
Not necessarily. That's the point. Okay, that's the point. That's oftentimes it doesn't, because you don't need to have the whole page repainted. You simply are looking for one piece of information which may turn this widget on or off or something like that. So it's kind of silly to have to get the entire page resent. Okay, so that's the essence, and we'll get into it a little bit. It's a little bit more arcane how this works, but that's the idea. So, but that brings up the issue of, as you pointed out, there's certain things that can be done locally. So the rule of thumb is if you can do it locally, try to do it there, okay? Because it decreases the overhead and everything else. Certain things you can't, so you might have to have some other alternatives. One of the other alternatives is if you want to use this in this kind of an environment, JSF, a lot of that sort of stuff is built in for you. So it does require trips to the server, but it means you don't have to be writing any JavaScript code. And in fact, even though you think to some extent that might be extra overhead, something I have said but might need to be repeated is that what JSF is really doing in some ways is writing JavaScript and HTML for you. If you look at any of your applications when they're running, and you're sitting there looking at the page, Duke or your messages or whatever the heck it is, and you do a view source. If you look at the view source, there's nothing in there that would lead you to believe it was JSF, okay? Because JSF, the servlet on the other side, the Faces servlet, what it's doing in the environment there is actually based upon the tags, the JSF tags you write and all the rest of that, is actually creating pure vanilla HTML and JavaScript on the other side, which then in fact may actually do some of these things that I'm talking about locally. In kind of but you don't have to worry about it because it's being done for you as a developer. Okay? So, for number 3 here, of course, JSF has some extra fields in the JSF equivalent tags that you would use in your forms versus the vanilla HTML. Now, HTML has actually started to catch up with this. That's number 1 to some extent. Okay, so things that can be done locally. As I said, you can write validators that are inside your Java beans. You can write custom validators for JSF apps that are totally separate from that are not tied to a specific bean, make it more generic, so you can use it in many different places. There's the Java Bean Validation API that I mentioned, and all those possibilities thereof. Okay, so there are many different things, many different ways you can attack this problem. So number 1, prior to HTML5, there was very little in the way HTML helped you. However, nowadays, there are in the input types, in the form input types, you only used to have like string and number or etc. So very little. Now, there's color, date time, an email string, that sort of thing that you can simply say the type equals email. And so it will attempt to do an email address check right inside of the HTML5 code. Things like that. Required is there too. Easy to add, does local validation, that's nice. No network overhead. The downside is it's not very tailorable, customizable. I mean, if you want to get just the basic stuff, it's fine. Okay, so maybe that's the first thing that you try to do. There's also some browser compliance issues that since it's somewhat newer, not everybody does it exactly the same way. The JavaScript-based validation, this is what people had been doing for a long time now. Again, client-side processing, no network, except as in Michael's case, for that sort of thing. Obviously, you've got to write JavaScript code. Somebody does. It has to be downloaded to the client. Okay. if you write it yourself, you've got to get it right. If you borrow or use other people's like jQuery's, you still have to download it. And of course, the issue about still needing server-side access. So here is a trivial example. This is an extract from an HTML page. You'd have a script section, or you could pull this in from using a reference to an external JavaScript library of your own. And this function could be in it. And then at the bottom is a fragment of form code. And you'll notice that the form, you have a name so it can reference it. And the onSubmit, which would normally be an activity like a post activity, that would be the action that gets done on the onSubmit. Actually, what it's going to do in this case is, you notice it says return validate form. So in other words, the onSubmit is looking for a true or false. Okay? OnSubmit, if it's true, it'll actually do the post and take the action. You see in the form. If it's false, it won't. It'll keep you on the same page. That's how OnSubmit works. So, so what you're doing is you're intercepting with your function there to do some checking. So validate form, let's go up, you look at it. You see this can get pretty arcane. JavaScript I don't find is the cleanest language to write or read, but what the var x is, you want to get into x the value of whatever they we're typing into the form, okay? So in this case, it is what you're looking to make sure is fname. Like, I don't know, I'm not sure what fname is in this form, but you want to make sure that they filled it in. So this is actually a required test. Because if you look at it, it says if it's null or if it's blank, then an alert box, this JavaScript alert box, pops up, and then they'll close it, and then it'll return false, which means you're stuck there. So, but they do now know that there was an error, that it was required. Okay? So that's the basic idea. Obviously, you can get a lot more sophisticated. It could be written better. And more importantly, you can use other JavaScript tools, something like this. Now, jQuery, I've used it. It's a wonderful library to use. I would recommend it if you need to use JavaScript code. But it also requires some learning to figure out how it works. Okay, so basically, this is the same idea. However, and what this is a JavaScript jQuery plugin that's being called here. I didn't show you how it's being pulled in, but just assume that it's available. And this, $ document ready stuff, that's jQuery. Okay? If we have enough time in class, I will be happy to start to introduce you to how it works. But jQuery essentially, in this regard, is like a pattern matcher. Okay? What it's doing is it's actually, see the hashtag myform? What it's doing there is it's saying, find me in the document object model tree. Now you know what the DOM is, right? You read about that. Okay, so in that tree, which every web page has as it's parsed by the browser, it's going to traverse the tree looking for an ID equal myform. Okay, and then it's going to call, if it finds it, the dot notation. So it's kind of like Java dot notation. That's the object, dot, call a method on it. And one of the nice things about jQuery, for example, not in this case, because you remember if it's a hashtag, that means there can only be one of them in the document, right? Because it's an ID. It has to be unique. But, for example, if you take the same idea and you wanted to, for every div that has a class of and there could be 10 of them, it will also match. And then the dot would do whatever it is to all of them in turn, one after the other. So it's a very powerful language, but it takes a little getting used to how it works. So in this case, all it's saying is, this rules business, that's its own, the plugin's own language. It's saying basically, as pretty easy to read, I think, now that you know what it's doing. It's going to validate, here are the rules, This is kind of like, by the way, this looks a little bit like JSON notation, when we get to that. So it says field 1 has to be required is true. It's got to be an email. Again, what you would have to do is go look at the plugin API that in jQuery to understand how you phrase these things and what it can do. So you can see it has required, it's got minimum length, maximum, a very powerful tool. So you could always use this. And then in our world, if you don't want to, yeah.
So I don't want to click submit button, but I want to validate the field as in when I type in the field.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding. You have to speak
I
up.
don't want to click the submit button on the form.
Yeah.
I just want to, like, whenever I write a string into it, it should let me know a message like this is the, like, if I type in a first name of a person, it's a 6-length character. If I type 4 letters, it's trying to submit the button, it goes to server and comes back with the message.
You can do that, but that would be, as soon as you're talking, again, what I said for Michael, as soon as you're talking to the server, that's Ajax. And that's built into jQuery, it's also built into JSF. Okay? So there are many things, and what you're doing in a case like that, so you're saying when I get up to 4 characters, I wanted to do something. Okay? That is, that's the one of the readings I gave to you for this week is event handling. That's an event.
Yeah, is it like something like on focus and something like that when you like the on focus function is called sort of, then when you go to the next field it will show immediately the error for the previous field?
Yes, what you're doing is there are, in JavaScript, there are many, there's like 25, or I forget, I never counted them, 20 something like that, different events that can be trapped. On focus means when you enter a field.
Right.
On blur, no, I'm telling them. on what do you think on blur means? When you leave. You see, you focus, blur, That's where the name came from. Anyway, you can, every time a person hits a key, that's an event. Every time they move the mouse, every time they move the mouse over some area on the screen, et cetera, et cetera. There again, you have to look on submit. That's another one when they hit the carriage return to leave the field. So yes, and you can associate with any of those events, any code you want, server-side code or client-side code.
The reason I mentioned the on-focus thing because you don't necessarily have to use Ajax to implement that error handling. Right?
No, I didn't mean that.
Right.
No, he said the magic word, which was, where did you want it checked?
On the client side.
No. You said you wanted the client to send it to the.
As soon as I leave the field, it should let me know.
It should send it to the server. That's what you said. That's why I answered it that way. But if you have all the information you need locally within the client, then you obviously don't have to go to the server. And that makes sense. If you're, what would make sense? Transferring the list of states, state abbreviations and Canadian provinces, if that's what, but you're not going to send, 100,000 records to be checked against. That doesn't make any sense. So you see, you have to balance those things. So if you can download a certain amount that's not a tremendous burden, then you can start to do things locally that you might have to do, with a network call. Okay, but that's as a designer, that's for you to figure out when you're doing performance, analysis. Okay, so. Now, another alternative to that, and as I said, really what you wind up doing is using all of these things in some way, shape, or form. So if you don't want to change your HTML, if you don't want to write special JavaScript code yourself, or even pull it in from someplace else, you don't have to. In this world, you can simply rely on JSF to do it for you and keep all of your coding on the server side. So you can, as you've seen already, you can make things required, you can check for length, you can check for whether they're strings or numbers, etc. And a lot of that is built in just the syntax of the JSF tags. But however, you can then go beyond that. Basic process, we talked about the JSF life cycle, the 6-step process. The very first set of steps has to do with checking for these kinds of things. First of all, are you getting the right data type? Or first of all, is it there? Then are you getting the right data type? And then you can do more analysis that, as I call it, maybe logical analysis. Is this date free to rent this car? Okay, I mean, there's no way you can do that on the client side. The server has to have access to that data somewhere. So ultimately, no matter what you do, you're going to have to go to the server to ask that. And then, of course, there has to be a closed loop there. If something is wrong, you have to have some way of communicating that back to the user, and so that they can figure out what to do next. Okay. So in this case, this is the shell. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about JSF style. You're using input text, which is the equivalent of the HTML form input, except it's got all of these other features that you have access to. And so the basic idea is that you use all of those features that you want to make sure it's in the format that you want, and you provide some place for the messages to be displayed if in fact that there's an issue. And then you can decide exactly which errors should be displayed and where they should be displayed. The system, JSF, will take care of the handling the cycle for you. You don't have to figure that out. You simply use these tools and it will do it for you. So if there is an error or of some sort, it will automatically repost it, send it back without you having to do that. That's one of the big differences between this kind of component-based processing and action-based. Remember I talked about that? Action frameworks like struts or something. In that case, you had to do a lot of this. In this case, you don't. You simply say, it's more declarative instead of procedural. You simply say, I want it to be required. And then it figures out how to make sure it gets filled in. Okay, I'm going to skip over this, but everybody knows now, just from looking at their code, what HPanel grid is. The idea is it's like building tables without saying the word table, so that it does basic layout. So one of the things I'll mention is right now in JSF it is table-based, HTML table-based. Remember I said that's the way all layout used to be done. I'm assuming that eventually, but that's not how we do it anymore. We use CSS nowadays. I mean, well, you're supposed to, though a lot of people still go back to the old style. That's actually what Panel Grid is doing. It's creating a little table, and then you're saying essentially in column 1 I want the label, column 2 is the field, and column 3 is the space for the error message. So that's what this is about. Okay, so we'll skip over that. But I assume you'll know how to do that. Okay, required. Run right through this. Is basically you say required equals true, and it will handle all the rest of that. Okay, so one thing I'll mention, as you can see over here, there's with each of these required, there's something called requiredMessage. We'll see with the other two things, converter and validator. There's also one of each. If you're going to use something like this required, use the message that goes with it also. Okay, because if you don't, it's going to do the best it can, which is usually pretty ugly looking. So that's just a tip, okay, if you're going to use that. And that's what this is saying. If you omit it, it will still produce the error message, but it may not be specified the way you want. Another thing is it won't be able to use basically, it won't be able to use, for example, the language that you want either. Okay? We talked about message bundles, resource bundles, and all that. If you use in that required message, here, actually, it's here, like this, messages, your error name. that allows you to, you associate messages with the message bundle, and then you can say, I want it in Urdu, I want it in Farsi, or I want it in English, or whatever. So that's another good reason to do it. So this is the basic flow of what's happening anytime somebody's interacting with this JSF cycle. Okay, so basically the red part there is ensuring the values are valid. And this first thing, valid means not empty. In other words, we're just checking for required. That would be the first thing that gets checked. So there is a sort of hierarchy of tests that happen in this particular order. So required is first. Then is type. All right. So if it's assuming that you filled it in, you got to get the type right. Now, just make sure you understand. HTML is all text-based. Okay. There is no concept of. It may look to you like you're typing in currency or you're typing in, scientific notation or whatever as numbers. It's all strings. Okay. So the place where it gets interpreted is someplace else. So it comes across as a string, then your side, like your Java bean, says, oh, that thing is supposed to be a decimal, okay, a double. So it better be able to convert from, whatever they typed in to be a double. If it doesn't, that's a conversion error, okay? So that happens for every single field like that. If you're typing in a string and you said it's a string, then there's essentially no conversion to do. There's never an error. Okay, that would be that's the second thing that gets checked, and the third thing are other kinds of validators. Validators that have to do with checking for length of things, like if it's a number, it can't be over 2 digits. And then, many other, or it can only be between and that sort of thing. So that would be the third level of checking. That's where the validator and validator message in JSF terms comes in. And that can be many different things. So here's a quickie example. This is the simple one, required, okay? It has those 4 fields. Let's see, user ID is a string, number, okay? The first bit amount is would be a decimal. It has a decimal point, so it's a double. This one is an int internally, okay? So that's really what you're looking for. Now, I'm not going to go through all this code because it's not really that interesting, except for let me point out, for the things that are not strings, if you say that the field is a little d double, okay, or a little I int, now those are different. Do you know in Java that there are equivalent class forms of those things? Big D double, okay. The little d double and little int are primitives, okay. However, and that's what's happening here, that's why you have to write the code in red. Okay, if you say, then you've got to do the conversion yourself. However, I'm going to cut right to the chase. Don't do that. Instead, in this case, in this world, in this environment, if you make it a big D double, okay, which uses the other form of doubles, or if it's integer, big I integer, okay, rather than int, then you won't have to worry about writing the code yourself, and it will be handled properly. Okay? Well, there's something here later that says that, but I want to try to get through this fast. Okay, so here is this form. All we're checking at this point is required. Okay, the things in red are simply the extra attributes you add to make that happen. The other thing at the top, the messages, there's 2 different forms. There's H messages and H message. Okay, H messages is a list of all of the error messages or validation messages that come back as an unordered UL, an HTML UL structure. Okay, so it'll come back and it'll have little dots in front of it usually. In this case, when you do that, you're saying if there are errors, no matter which thing generated the errors, when they come back, they're going to go up at the top above where the form was. It'll stick it in there on the way back during the post back. Remember post back? That's when the JSF sends it directly back without going through the other cycles. So in this case, and you don't have to put it up there, you could put it at the bottom if you wanted to, all right? But this will display them all together. So it may not be clear, it's convenient, but not necessarily clear which one is associated with which field. Hence the reason that you usually put it next to it, okay? So these are all the requireds. You see it here. This is where it attempts to bring it in. This is what they would see. They start to, if they didn't enter anything, this is what they would see. You see how it creates the unordered list there? Okay. So that's kind of the basic way that works. And all the rest of this really works about the same way. When you want to make it nicer for them, then instead of putting all the error messages at the top, which could be, besides not knowing necessarily easily which goes with which thing, if you have a long form, let's say you're filling out a large application or something, you might not be able to see, literally not be able to see, particularly on devices like this. You can't see down too far in the form, when you come back, so you might not know. You might not even know there was an error there because you can't see the entire thing at once. So usually what you do is you put the errors close to where the error happened, okay? And that's where that panel grid business comes in handy, right? It's not the only way that you can do that. You could pop up JavaScript messages, whatever the heck you want. But this is kind of a nice, easy way of doing this. One of the other things, I don't think I mentioned it anywhere here, but I'll show you later on in some of the code, there is this concept of severity that is built into the messages. And if you have like 4 or 5 different levels, one is like critical, warning, info, like that. You can associate them with different class styles. You could, I think by default, the critical is red, a warning is yellow, and the info is green, okay? Kind of a natural thing. So that's another way of giving feedback that they know, this has to be fixed versus, we just wanted you to realize this. And that's what this is. This is just the layout. This is really more a layout issue than anything else, okay? So here, now, if you use that code, you wind up more like this, okay? And this will be true whether it's required or the other ones. That idea all comes back, all right? This is what I was referring to before, so I'm going to cut it through that problem. If you're going to do, in your beans, your managed beans, instead of making them little d doubles, for example, to hold currency, dollar values or something like that, make them big D, and then you won't have to worry about writing that code in red. It will actually convert it for you. And if it can't, then it will generate, the proper messages. Likewise, if it's an int, like you're just, getting a number of days or something that's an integer, if you use a, big I integer as the type, then it'll do the same thing. And that takes care of 99% of the problems, I think. And then if it catches one of those things, you have access to converter message. So you can say that wasn't a number, okay? And you can say it in some nice way that's makes sense for your application. Again, same rule. If you're going to expect this ever to happen, then you write the message. It will put up a message, but not will be what you usually want. So always use it. And likewise for the validator message, same thing. Okay, so this is just the example of doing it this way. This just makes your life easier. So here's the example of it in effect here. Basically, what they're checking here is, okay, first is the required, you see. Then is, you'll see, then what would happen is if they then filled it in and got it wrong, it would come back, like they did here. It would come back and then say it passed the required test, but it failed the conversion test. That's why you see the second one there. Until they finally get it right. Now, there are, for basic simple things, there are tags already available to you. Okay. For example, and this is the third type. This is where validator message comes in. Validate is the F. This is the other one of the other JSF libraries, right? This is the core library. No, I can never remember because they didn't use. I think the H is the core library. F is I forget what it's called. Function library. Anyway. So there are other JSF tags. These are the ones that start F:. So there's a list of these that will check for length, range, of numbers, those basic things. Okay. And again, if you expect it to happen, always supply your own message. Here are the ones that you usually see that you can easily use. That if you can. You want to check for length. It's not too short. It's not too long. It can do that. That's for ints, and then for the doubles would be the second one. I'm sorry. Length is strictly the length of the values. Is it two numbers, two characters, or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever it is you're checking? The long is, the int values, the doubles are decimal point, floating point values, and then maybe the most powerful one, if you're good at doing regular expression hacking, is the regex. That will allow you to, if you want to get a phone number in, let's say, in exactly the right format, or a credit card number, this might be one way. You'd have to write your own regular expression handler, but if you have ever used that, there's a lot of stuff that you can write for doing pattern matching. So in this case, this is a little more sophisticated. We're going to say it's 5 or 6. Three words for the keyword, at least 10 cents, at least 15 days. So you see now that has to pass. Is it required? Is it there? Did it convert properly? And does it match this? So you see it's this multi-level validation process. So in this case, you notice where it falls. The other ones that we've been using fell inside of it was one of the attributes to input text. You see? This is actually a tag in and of itself, which is why we have the closing tag, the input text closing tag here. It has to be inside of that element, but it's not inside of the tag itself. So it's between there and before the closer. So any of those ones that we were just talking about, this is where it would go. Okay? And then the validator message would be associated with that. So you can only do one evaluation per. Yeah.
These are like attributes like validate length and validate minimum character. Can you hook up a function into the input type? Like suppose I'm entering a data for user field.
In other words, you want to write a custom validator. Yes, that was one of the things I was asking you to do for your assignment. I will show you. Okay, I won't leave you in the lurch. That's why I wanted to give you some extra time so you had a chance for me to show you. Besides simply, you read about them in the books, right? So you have examples there if you want to use those. But yes, those are custom, and there are actually 2 different flavors of doing that. So there is, here's where he's validating for the minimum value cost, and the other one was the minimum days. Okay? Yeah, great.
So if you have a validator message defined on the input text element, and you have more than one validator in something, does it just prefer that message that you put in as a validator message?
That's tricky. As a matter of fact, I have a note in here that says don't mix and match them. Okay? Because it's difficult to know which one is going to be done first, and it's kind of tricky to figure out which message goes with which one in that case.
Right.
Okay? But you're right, it can get a little messy. Okay? You may just have to play with it until you get it the way you want. But in generally speaking, if you're using one of these F validators, you don't mix it with one inside as the yeah, exactly. Okay. I mean, there's always an out. The out of this is the custom validator, okay, which will allow you to do virtually anything you want, including, complex, validations. Is it within this time period, but is it a month with an arm in it, is the person nice, is blah, blah, blah. And you can, all of that stuff can figure into your, again, what I would call logical validations, the more high-level semantic validation. But you can actually get like 95% of what you're looking for using just the built-in tools. But there are going to be times, well, here, I'll show you one in a second. So here is, again, missing data, it gets that first, type conversion, it gets that second, range validation, you say, and it'll do those, what you're seeing here is it'll do them in that order, okay? If they put the values in and they got them wrong, they would have jumped right to here. You never would have seen the previous two, okay? Until everything passes. So that's an important concept. Again, I just mentioned this idea with long forms, and this is even more true with the small devices, okay? There's only very little that you can actually usually see at once. So if you're trying to collect a lot of information and you say there's an error, 10 fields down, it's not necessarily easy for them to know that, okay? They might not visually be able to detect that. So a couple of things that you might do. I'll show you in a second. But the major thing is something like this. They're always going to see the top. So what might you say? And I'll show you an easy way to check. There are errors, folks. Look down there somewhere, and I'll tell you when you get there what they are. So the question is, how do you know, as the developer, how do you know that there were errors so that you can tell them, to do something without telling them what the error messages were? Well, actually, it's down here, but I'll show it to you in a second in actual its location. So here's an example of that. Here's the JSF tag that's the output text tag. So it'll display fix errors marked below with that particular class, that CSS styling, rendered. Now remember, the JSF tags, there are, each one of these has got many different attributes, but there are certain common ones that you see in all of them. ID, name. One of them is this one, and that's very important for your design, rendered. Rendered means, is it being shown or not, okay? If you use this, that thing, whatever it is, has to evaluate to either, thank you, true or false, okay? I don't care what it is. It could be a bean, 12 beans deep, 12 methods deep. As long as it evaluates to a true or false, then if it's true, everything, in other words, everything, that thing, okay, and it could be a block of, excuse me, it can also be a block of HTML2 will be displayed or not displayed. This is one way that you can, just that concept, you can attach the rendered to many different things, okay? And it's a very powerful concept because it allows you to tailor what is being displayed, let's say, to the user. Okay, so if that thing there, this particular one has to do with the, this is very special. This faces context, that's an object you have access to everywhere in JSF. A message list is the list of those messages. So in other words, it's saying if it's not empty, then you're going to see whatever it is. Otherwise, it's going to skip this. Okay? However, this rendered idea you can use for anything that you want to display. If you don't want to see this whole form altogether, you can render it out, based upon which user. Or you can decide, only administrators can see this versus, that. That sort of thing. So keep that in mind. That's actually a very powerful concept. So here's the case where you see you've got a very, very long form. You might not be able to see the errors at the bottom. You give them a clue. Feedback just in general, this is something, I'm not sure how much time we have in the class, to go over this, but in terms of just site and page design, there are many different concepts. If you want to find out about this in detail, take my human-computer interface class in the spring, where we don't deal with the guts of how you build a site so much as the design aspects of it. It's kind of the other side of this whole idea. One of the things that's really critical is feedback. Okay, well, no matter what you do, let the user know what's going on. Okay, and that could mean lots of things like good error messages. It could mean if you have a very long-running transaction that you give them some kind of a progress bar. I mean, there are many different ways that this can be expressed. Another thing, just in that same vein as a design idea, is something called, when you're doing page design, is something called above the fold. Have you ever heard that term? Above the fold. The idea is that it comes from newspapers. Okay? Above, you know how you have a newspaper. You buy the New York Times. What is it? You don't get it like this. You get it like this, right? And then how do you read it? This is above the fold. That is below the fold. That's an important concept in publishing. It's been around for hundreds of years. Okay, so that's why all the important stuff is at the top of the newspaper. Same thing. Okay, the important stuff should be at the top of your pages, and then you should let. And in this case, is a good example. You should let them know there's more. Or there's other important stuff farther down, so they have some idea. Because I don't care what kind of device you have now, and it's worse nowadays with the little devices, they're not going to be able to know everything without you giving them some clues of where to find it on the pages. Okay, now, just to tie this up, some of these, here we go, custom validation. This is kind of the trapdoor that allows you to do pretty much any kind of validation you want. And they're really, two different kinds of that. So these things at the top are what we just discussed. Okay, the first four things. If one of those F validators doesn't suit you, but you have something pretty straightforward for checking on a particular field, then you could do it goes by different names, but I call it manage bean-based validation. In other words, you write a routine inside the manage bean that the thing is dealing with. Okay, remember these are all input fields of some kind, form fields, and then you can write that routine such that it will be called automatically and do whatever it is that you want to check for, and it will return true or false. Okay, true means it's whatever it is passed. Otherwise, it'll set the errors and then send it back. Now that's fine if you have something, let's say, that only applies in one or two places. So it's rather special to that particular field. If you want to take that same idea and say, oh, I have this thing I have to check in many different places on many different pages and different forms. Then, as an alternative to that, you have a custom validator, which is also, they're just methods, okay? They just are written slightly differently, but they work approximately the same way. The only difference between these two concepts is, again, very specific, really makes sense in the context of this particular bean and its values and what's around it, then maybe you go with the first one. If you want to write a routine that you can call from everywhere, okay, that isn't quite so specific, then you might go the second route. Okay, but in terms of what they can do, they can really do pretty much the same thing. So the way this works is that validator equals is an attribute of input text itself. Okay, so this is where you see how it fits in there. It looks like required equals true, blah, 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 equals, it's just another one of those. Except what it's doing is it's calling, you can see the method in your bean. And the And that's where the checking would be done. So in other words, you just add a method to your bean code. Michael, you were asking about where these things go. That's one of them, okay? In terms of, if you're talking about the other one, then you would, often write a routines library of them by themselves, that might live somewhere else in their own class library or class or their own package, okay? They can live anywhere. It doesn't really make any difference, but, if they're going to be shared, then more than likely you would give them their own package and let them live there so it's easy to find them all, okay? Let's see, so I'll show you how this works. Basically, the way that it doesn't return a true or false, and matter of fact, they both work this way, they throw exceptions. Everybody understand what I mean, right? Okay, and everybody knows their Java exception handling, right? Okay, so they throw particular kinds of exceptions that JSF then can look for, okay? And then basically what you do is, if you do the checking, it doesn't pass, then you set the error message that you want to go back, and then throw the exception. And JSF handles all the rest of it for you. Okay? That's really the way both of them work. Okay? And this was my, Greg, you were asking, this thing at the bottom.
At the bottom, that's all.
I'm sorry. Don't use them together. It's not that you can't, it's just that it gets a little messy because it's who wins. It may not be obvious which one is going to win, and so which error message are you going to see? But I mean, there may be some cases where you want to do that, okay? But in general, you probably don't, because it can get messy. So here, this is the manage bean template, and they would all look like this. I mean, basically, this test, however complicated it is the only thing that's really different. Pretty much different. All of that stuff there, the header, the argument list and all that is boilerplate. You just put that in, okay? So it's called this way, and it throws that exception. You do, here we're creating a variable, then we do a test, create the message text, and then basically, whatever it says for this particular error. This is actually going to tack the message onto the faces message, and then you return the message, like that. Okay. One of the things, though, that you have to remember is that this is an important thing to notice. See how this is being called? This is the actual value, whatever it was that they entered. It's being passed as object. Now, object, in the Java tree is the root, okay? It doesn't say it's an int or a string. It just says, I'm an object, okay? That's why the casting is important here. So typically, you're going to try to cast it to the thing that you expected it to be, okay? And it'll fail. If it doesn't cast properly, that's another error. It'll catch that too, okay? So if you expected it to be an integer, then you would call it an integer at that point. In this case, it's expected to be a double, so you say, I'm going to cast it as a double. Okay, so you got that idea? That's the basic idea. So here's an example validating a room number. It can only be if, I didn't make these particular ones up. Marty Hall, who's a well-known, actually he's one of the authors of the next version of your core Java server faces book. He gave me a lot of these. In this case, I'm not sure I would want to go to this place, but this is some resort where the health department has shut down all the rooms except number 2 and number 7. So I'm not even sure I would want to go to number 2 or 7, honestly speaking. But you see, this is not one of your typical kind of validations. This is obviously something very special that requires special logic. So here we can use the validator method in the bean, throw an exception if it's not, if they're asking for something else besides 2 or 7. If otherwise, the validation passes. Okay, so you would write the validator. You would call it in the input text, and it would look something like this. So here's the bean. okay? That is going to be the managed bean that you're dealing with. And here is a validator that does what we just said. It's going to check if it's whatever is being passed in. If it's not 2 or 7, then it will generate a proper error message. Okay, so you see that you can make the validation as complex as you want, and it should be able to handle it. Okay, so this is the bean style, and I'll let you. If you follow it through, then you'll see it actually. They ask for number 3 there, and the validation, your validation failed with that particular test, and that was the message that got sent back. And then the last one of these, I don't mean to beat this to death, but the fact is that this is so often used, it's good to know how all these things work, is the F colon validator. This is, in other words, this is like writing your own F colon validate blah, to use Marty's terms. Okay, you can validate anything this way, and when you write it into the tag, it looks like the F validate blah. It goes the same way, except it calls your routine versus one of the built-in ones. Okay, what it does again. The reason for this versus the other one is really if you say I'm going to use this everywhere. It's such a common thing. I'm checking for credit card numbers, which is you might have because I've seen them. They exist in various places. Are credit card number checkers in a sort of a syntactic, partially semantic validation. Now, what I mean by that is credit card numbers have particular lengths. They can only contain particular numbers in particular places, okay? Because of how the credit card number companies make the numbers up. They're not just any number, okay? For example, all Amex cards start with 3, I think. All MasterCards start with 4, right? And so there are certain rules like that. But some of which you can check syntactically, but then when you get to the point of checking, is this a valid number in the sense of, is it active? Does it belong to that person? That's something else. That's a different level of semantics you're checking. But that kind of thing, if you have that many places in your application, then that would make sense to do it this way, because then it's easy just to tack it on to any credit card field that you write. And you don't have to put it in a bean, or anything like that. You just make it again, Michael, you put it in your own package, you put it in its own class or as one of a class of validators, and you call it that way. And it will be consistent across all of them. So it has, again, very similar in terms of the boilerplate, how it's called. It throws a validator exception also. And then in this case, you can set various things. One of the things, really the thing that adds the message is this thing here, this context.add message. But there are other things. You don't have to set all these things if you don't want to. But if you wanted to set some of these other things, I'll leave it to you to look it up, what these methods are actually doing, but I think you get the basic idea as to the kinds of message, particularly this one, it might be useful. Severity error, that's an enumerated type. That would mean it would be always usually red versus warning versus information or something like that. But you see it's very similar to how the other one works. So again, mixing them together gets a little tricky. Probably don't do that, only because it can get confusing. Yeah, let's see. Oh, there's my point. In the case like this particular case, the validator message, if you look at that example, this page and the previous page, the validator message would win, but that isn't necessarily what you want. So anyway, just a little detail there. Okay? All right, so that should help you with your homework, I hope. Yes? No? Give it more more context for it now. Okay, so what I will do, unfortunately you can't see from a lot of it because of the way that the screen is shrunk here, so you'll have to bear with me here. Let's see how much of the code I can actually show you. But, oh, actually, well, yeah, there's one more thing in particular I wanted to show you. Let's see here. Yes, this was your own code. Boy, is this... There's a... For you to be able to see this, the resolution of the screen here is so much lower. My machine here is, this screen here is 2880 by, I forget, 1600 or 18, I don't know, something like that. As a matter of fact, I can't even read it most of the time if I put it at regular resolution, because the characters are just big. And I don't know why this particular screen is not giving me a higher resolution, but I'm afraid I'm just going to have to deal with it. When I was testing it before, I could actually see things better. Let me see if I can... not sure how big things actually turn out to be here. Oh, that's a little too small. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so... all right, so let me put, okay. So this is actually, I don't know if I can get rid of that, no. This is actually a version, I took, your Duke example, and I added some of this stuff to the guessing game, all right, just to show the idea. So hopefully, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but to show you what I did is I added a little bit of JavaScript and jQuery code just to show you how a simple event happens. And then I put in now actually this is a useful JSF tag. The UI library, okay, which is the template library, if you go back up here, you see UI, this is the facelets template library. H is the basic HTML, F is the core, oh, that's right. And here's one that you haven't seen yet, this one here, called pass-through. And the idea there is that if you want to allow HTML5 to do what it would normally do, okay, then you can say pass it through, all right, pass the HTML5 attributes, which are not part of the JSF attributes, allow them to be activated. Okay, so I'll show you quickly what I mean by that. Now, in the UI library is one of the tags is called remove. This is sort of like the equivalent of a JSF comment handle. You know how you normally put, slash star slash around something, or slashes in front of it in Java. If you put this around something inside of your JSF, it'll ignore it. Okay. Now, the reason I did that is because it's like a little place for me to hold things while I'm not using them. I'm not sure I'm going to bother to take you through all of this, but essentially here, if I run this, wow. I don't know why this is so large compared to, I have another screen like this that I was working with, but I can't get this one down at a lower resolution. Higher resolution. So it's smaller, so you have to bear with me, I'm afraid, I'm sorry. Everything is so large here. Okay. I had it all set up before, but I had to reboot my machine, so it'll take a second for everything to start up again. But you recognize Duke, okay. All right. So you know, at this point, if I put nothing in this, actually there was a little bit of validation on this, the JSF demo, your original one, but I took it out, I think. Okay, so no, obviously that doesn't look too good. And now you can put in anything, you know. Oh, come on. Not sure why it's not. Not sure why it didn't take that. Let me see. Where did I leave this? The user number. Let me do it again. Okay, so if I say. Oh, perfect example of what I just said. Okay, above the fold. Obviously, so let me do this. That would have made it so I could see it. So it was working, and I didn't know. Okay. So here now there is. You might now, if we go back and look quickly, you'll notice there's the this guy here. This is the tag for the input field, right? It doesn't say anything here about number, does it? I mean, specifically. The reason, though, and this is where JSF is trying to do its best for you, so you don't have to worry about things without you having to think about it. The reason that came up is, in fact, because if you look at the bean, which I won't bother with, the bean is that field is a numeric field, okay, that it was trying to fill in. And because it knew that it was a number, it knew that it didn't convert properly, and hence the error message. Okay, so that you got for free simply by saying that the bean variable was a number. Okay, all right, but obviously you can do much better than that. Let's see. So I've got a whole bunch of things up here. I think we'll skip over the obvious ones. Required equals true, obviously. Required message, a number is required. Now, before, normally that's, and minimally you would put that in, okay? Just to, if in fact it is required, that it can't be blank. So you'd always put something like that in for those. However, just this allows me to point something else out, which, as I said, is here's user number bean, okay? So the reason I got that error message was, in fact, it looked here and said, aha, it's a number, okay? Because that's what they're trying to fill in, is that field value. That's how it knew, okay? And it generated its own standard message for that. Now, however, and this actually points out something which will, if I have enough time, we'll get into more detail. But if you read about the Java Bean Validation API, that's a specification of annotations like some of the other things you've seen so far, like the stateless and named and manage bean and all those things, those annotations. There's a set of annotations, and of course you would have to include the library. That's this library here. There are a number of, if you say constraints star, you'd have a whole bunch of these. But this not only works here, it also works on entities, which is very nice. That's much closer than to the database. If you want to make sure that a field does not go in as null into your database, you could actually attach this to that. Here we're attaching it to the bean field itself, the bean property called, and the way that you do that is simply by putting it right in front of it. So this not null is one of the annotations that is associated with these fields. So if I'm saying, effectively this is another version of required. Okay, so it doesn't say that it has to be a number, it just says that it has to be not null. So if I save that, if I run it again, now I didn't put the, let me see, did that run? I didn't put the required stuff in, right? Okay. However, if I try to do it now, see what happens? So they're actually, I would advise that you take a quick look at the Java Bean validation API, because that is got a number of things that could actually take the place of having to write a lot of this other code, because it will catch it also, you see? Anyway, so that sort of pointed that out as, oh, no, I'm sorry, not there, greeting. Okay. So, again, I don't want to spend too much time here, but, you know, here's the validator, okay? This is the one that goes inside of the input text as an attribute. User number being validate number range. So I wrote this, okay, this didn't exist in your code. I simply, you know, stuck it down as part of as a method in the bean, and here's an example of that, okay? I called it with the standard attributes. Then I tried to cast value as an integer, because I know that's what it's supposed to be. This is the guess, 0 to 10 guess. And I did my own hand checking, okay? This is more easily done, obviously, with the range stuff, right? But you can imagine, I'll leave it to you to say, you know, it's more complicated than that. So you write your own code there to do the test, and then then you can create the message, throw the validator exception, etc. You got your own manage bean style validator. Okay, so I won't do that for this, but you can see that's how that's done. Likewise, well, validate double range. This is one way of doing the range checking. Okay, that's the way I probably would have done it, or one of the ways, instead of what I just wrote there. So also here, this is the other style, F validator. That would go right there, okay? This particular one, this one doesn't exist. So what do I have it do? It's doing user number being, this one. Minimum, no. Oh, there it is. Negative value validator, okay? So I wrote one that doesn't exist necessarily, which is the negative value validator. Again, it looks very similar to the other one, except it's checking for negative values. Okay, so that one doesn't exist. So that one was more special than they had. Okay, so again, I guess the rule of thumb is, well, let me show you the last one or two here. So we've got size and length. Those are part of JSF. Okay, so that'll catch a lot of things. Make sure it's required if it is. I'll get back to the on mouse over in a second. That's the last thing I'll show you, and we'll take a break. Here is the pass-through stuff. Now, if you look at the HTML5 spec for input, all right, it'll say type equals, email, type equals phone, so that might be nice. That might be what you want. So that doesn't exist in regular HTML, old style. It doesn't exist in JSF per se. You would have to write something for some of those yourself. So if you want to use one of those, you import this library, okay? The pass-through library that I mentioned before. I called it PT. You can call it whatever you want. And then what I did is I went and I started to pick off those newer types and features from the ones that are in the newer HTML5 specification. So specifying it as a number is one. Actually, we already saw we got that for free. Min and max is there. Now, and here, this I'll actually, let me borrow this and run it. Actually, let me borrow that one too. Might as well kill two birds with one stone there. Let me put it down. Let's see, I've got to put it, where the heck am I? I've got to put it inside. These all go inside. Whoop, that's not what I wanted. I wanted to control. Okay, let's clean it up. I put it inside the input text as attributes. Okay, so now let's see what happens. Notice what you'll see right away. You see something that's different? this thing where it says 0 through 10 here, okay, that's an HTML5 feature that's called placeholder, which is really cool. That's a nice thing that you should probably always use if you can, because it's again, feedback. Anything you can tell the user about how you want them to act or what is expected of them is good. Okay, the more you can do, the easier it is for them, the happier they'll be making fewer mistakes. Not only that, what were some of the other things that were there? So there's placeholder, that's a nice one. Min and max, that is what is generating this thing here. See what it did? Yeah, I can't, well, that's because I was typing those in before into that field, that's why they're there. But I cannot enter anything but 0, say I can't go below that, and I can't go above the 10. So it's doing automatic checking, okay, by using that kind of, what would you call a number scroller or something like that. So if you like that makes sense. You say you can only order X amount of things, then maybe this makes sense, okay? And let's see, what else? Autofocus. Autofocus is nice if you want to make sure the cursor goes right to a particular field. It'll jump there without them moving themselves. And the other thing, okay, so those are all of there are more. You'd have to look up the HTML5 spec for input. And there are a bunch of other things like that are kind of cool, right? A placeholder minimally is something I like. Because that little grayed out thing is a great cue for your users. Now the other thing, to get back to we were talking about events, all right, is the on mouse over. Now that's generic to all of the HTML. So you have access to it here, all right? So you have on whatever, on change, on mouse over, on blur, on move, whatever. The way we see it here is, let me see if I've got it activated. Oops, let me make this a little smaller. What I'm doing here is I say it's on mouse over, which means if the mouse moves over this thing with this widget, it will actually do whatever is on mouse over. See? Okay. In that case, now you say, where's that coming from? All right, where that's coming from is, in this case, this is typically a piece of JavaScript. And in this case, I wrote this little, let's go back up here. There's the JavaScript, okay? And basically what it does is it checks that you're in num field. Num field is the name of this thing down here I gave it, see? Num field. So this is jQuery. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. I loaded here this thing, script sourcing. That's loading the jQuery library. Okay. So that's why I can actually write this jQuery code in the JavaScript. So here, whoops. So here, the my tooltip is what's get called on mouse over, and you can do anything you want at this point. This particular case, I could have written this myself, but it was a lot uglier. I'm not that good a JavaScript programmer. But I've used these kinds of things before, and so hover is a jQuery routine for doing exactly what it did, is it hovered. It found me hovering over it, okay? That's what the thing is. And then in this case, tooltip is a field there, which is down. You see, you didn't see it because it was below. See the division there? This guy here. So when it says tooltip, this is what it's referring to. This piece of HTML. So it's saying if I am hovering over num field, then show tooltip, which means actually turn. Literally, what it does is it turns the display block. Yes, if you know what I'm talking about. That's a display as an attribute, an HTML attribute. Display : block. Actually, I'm sorry, it's a CSS attribute. Okay, it changes it to block, which means show. Okay, versus the opposite, okay? So that's how it does show and hide. So every time I move onto it, it flips it to show. Every time I leave it, it goes to hide, and that's why when I come over it, as soon as I come over it, it appears. Every time I leave it, it goes. Okay? So hopefully that little set of examples will kind of round out all the different kinds of things that you can do. So I guess that you should be able now to write some validators for your homework. And because you have those examples plus the examples in the texts that I had you read too. Okay? You know, is this important? Well, it's not as important as maybe some other design issues, but it certainly is something that your users think is important because this is what they touch all the time. So it's good for you to make it easy for them and to get it right. Okay? Okay, so let's take a break.